What happens when the anxious partner finally walks away from the avoidant? Most people assume it's just another breakup, but in reality, the power dynamic flips, and the one who's been running is suddenly confronted with feelings they've been avoiding all along. This shift doesn't just change the relationship, it changes both people in surprising, powerful ways. When the anxious partner finally decides to walk away, the very first and most dramatic change that occurs is that the avoidant loses control over the emotional narrative they had always believed was theirs to manipulate. In the relationship, the avoidant thrives on distance, on creating enough uncertainty that the anxious person stays hooked, always second-guessing themselves, always fighting to close the gap. This power dynamic works because the avoidant feels they are in control. They get to dictate the pace of intimacy. They decide when to pull closer and when to pull away. And the anxious person becomes accustomed to trying to read the avoidance signals, trying to anticipate their moods, trying to soothe the disconnection that constantly threatens the relationship. But the moment the anxious person no longer plays that role, the story shifts entirely. Suddenly, the avoidant can't rely on silence or withdrawal to hold power, because the anxious person is no longer waiting on the other end. They are gone. And that loss of an emotional anchor shocks the avoidant into realizing that their grip was never as secure as they thought. This change is so significant because for the first time, the avoidant is forced into a reactive position. Where they were once the one setting the tone, they now find themselves scrambling to make sense of what just happened. They are no longer dictating the emotional climate of the relationship. They are responding to a new reality they didn't plan for. Their usual tactics, ignoring calls, avoiding conversations, withholding affection, suddenly have no impact because the anxious person has stopped seeking validation from them. That silence that used to give them power now only amplifies their own sense of emptiness. This creates an unfamiliar vulnerability in the avoidant, and even if they don't admit it out loud, they feel the ground shifting beneath them. Losing control over the narrative means they no longer have the reassurance that someone is waiting in the wings, holding space for their return. And the absence of that dynamic destabilizes the avoidant in ways they struggle to understand. For the anxious partner, this moment is the first taste of liberation, but for the avoidant, it is the first taste of genuine fear. Their confidence in being able to come and go as they please without consequence is shattered, and it forces them to confront how fragile their supposed control really was. In truth, the avoidance control was always dependent on the anxious person's willingness to play along. Once that willingness disappears, the avoidant is exposed. They may try to reclaim control through sudden bursts of vulnerability, reaching out with carefully chosen words, or trying to re-enter the anxious person's life with promises of change. But underneath all of that is a deeper panic, the panic of realizing they no longer get to shape the story. What makes this loss of control so profound is that it forces the avoidant to see that detachment is not power when the other person chooses detachment too. And that truth is both humbling and frightening because it dismantles the very strategy they built their relationships around. This shift in narrative control doesn't just change how the avoidant sees the anxious partner, it changes how they see themselves. They are used to being the one who withholds, who creates the rhythm of closeness and distance, but now they are left without a script, uncertain of what comes next, and that uncertainty often feels unbearable. It challenges the avoidant to recognize that control in relationships is an illusion and that genuine connection requires mutual investment, not games of withdrawal and pursuit. Losing control over the emotional narrative is not just a temporary disruption for them. It is the unraveling of a dynamic they believed would always protect them. And as it falls apart, they are left exposed to the very emotions they've spent a lifetime trying to avoid. When the anxious partner finally chooses to walk away from the avoidant, one of the most powerful changes that occurs is that the anxious person reclaims their self-worth and confidence, something they often felt stripped of throughout the relationship. In the dynamic with an avoidant, the anxious partner usually finds themselves constantly questioning their value, always wondering if they are enough, if they are lovable, if they are too needy or too much. This constant self-doubt is fueled by the avoidance pattern of withdrawing, withholding, and creating distance, which makes the anxious partner work harder to prove their worth, often sacrificing their boundaries and ignoring their own needs in the process. But the moment they step away, the anxious partner stops looking at themselves through the distorted mirror the avoidant has been holding up, and they begin to see themselves clearly again. They realize that their sensitivity, their willingness to love deeply, and their desire for connection are not weaknesses to be ashamed of, but strengths to be valued. This reclamation of self-worth doesn't happen all at once. It often begins quietly, with the simple act of saying no more, of deciding they will not chase someone who consistently makes them feel small. That choice alone carries a surge of empowerment because for the first time, the anxious partner places their needs above the approval of someone who has been unable to meet them emotionally. Each step they take away from the avoidant reinforces the idea that they deserve better. And in doing so, they start to rebuild confidence that had been eroded over time. This confidence is not about arrogance or pretending they don't care. It is about grounding themselves in their own value, recognizing that their worth does not hinge on whether someone else chooses to stay or go. This shift often awakens a sense of dignity that had been buried under years of anxiety-driven patterns. And once that dignity returns, it becomes very difficult for the anxious person to accept anything less than mutual respect in future relationships. For the anxious partner, regaining confidence also means discovering freedom from the exhausting cycle of pursuit. When they no longer pour all their energy into deciphering mixed signals, chasing breadcrumbs of affection, or trying to bridge endless emotional gaps, they suddenly have space to invest in themselves again. They may start reconnecting with passions, friendships, or goals they once abandoned in order to keep the relationship alive. This act of redirecting energy back into their own life not only strengthens their sense of independence, but also restores balance to how they see themselves in relationships. Instead of viewing themselves as someone who has to work harder to keep love, they begin to understand that true love does not require losing oneself in the process. This newfound perspective transforms the anxious partner's confidence into something steady and unshakable, built not on external validation, but on self-recognition and inner strength. This change also ripples outward because once the anxious person reclaims their self-worth, they naturally start setting higher standards for how they will be treated. They become less tolerant of inconsistency, manipulation, or avoidance, and more attuned to recognizing when someone is capable of meeting their emotional needs. This doesn't mean they become hardened or closed off, but rather that they carry themselves with a quiet strength that demands respect without having to plead for it. That strength is often deeply attractive to others because it signals a person who knows their value and will not settle for less. In essence, when the anxious partner walks away and reclaims their self-worth, they are not just leaving behind a painful relationship. They are stepping into a more authentic version of themselves, one that no longer chases love out of fear, but chooses it out of mutual respect and alignment. This growth becomes one of the most profound transformations in their journey, and it changes how they show up not only in relationships, but in every area of their life. For the avoidant, this collapse is particularly destabilizing because their entire strategy for maintaining emotional distance depends on the anxious person's persistence. The chase validates the avoidant's sense of importance while allowing them to keep intimacy at bay. When the anxious partner removes themselves from that cycle, the avoidant is left without the comfort of knowing someone is still waiting for them on the other side of their withdrawal. They suddenly experience a void where there was once constant pursuit, and in that silence they are forced to confront a reality they've avoided, that their distance does not guarantee safety, it only guarantees loneliness when the other person refuses to play along. This collapse dismantles the illusion of control the avoidant thought they had, showing them that the game only works when both people remain willing participants, and the absence of pursuit exposes the vulnerability they've worked so hard to hide. For the anxious partner, the collapse of this dynamic is both terrifying and liberating. It is terrifying because for so long their sense of connection was tied to the pursuit, to the belief that if they just tried harder, gave more, or proved their worth, the avoidant would finally respond with love and closeness. Letting go of the chase feels, at first, like giving up on love itself. But as time passes, it becomes liberating because they realize that the cycle was never bringing them real security, only temporary relief followed by deeper pain. By stepping out of the dynamic, the anxious person begins to taste a new kind of freedom, one that allows them to conserve their emotional energy and redirect it toward people and experiences that nourish rather than drain them. They see that real love does not demand constant pursuit, and that connection should not be a one-sided effort to bridge gaps someone else is intent on maintaining. This realization begins to shift the anxious partner's entire understanding of what love should feel like, replacing desperation with clarity and self-respect. The collapse of the chase and run pattern also forces both individuals to face themselves in ways they often avoided while trapped in the cycle. Without the distraction of constant pursuit, the avoidant must sit with the discomfort of their own fears of intimacy and loss, while the anxious partner must confront the deeper wounds that drove their need to chase in the first place. This creates a turning point where both people have the chance to grow beyond the roles they've been repeating. For the anxious, it is the chance to build healthier patterns of self-worth and boundaries. For the avoidant, it is the chance to recognize that intimacy is not suffocation, but a requirement for meaningful connection. And though the collapse may feel like destruction in the moment, it is also the opening of space where both can step into something different, something healthier, if they are willing to face the truths that the dynamic once kept hidden. When the anxious partner finally steps away from the avoidant, another profound change that unfolds is that the avoidant is suddenly forced to face emotions they have long suppressed and carefully hidden, not just from others, but from themselves. In the anxious avoidant cycle, the avoidant relies heavily on distancing strategies to keep overwhelming feelings at bay. They bury vulnerability under layers of independence, distraction, and emotional detachment, convincing themselves that they don't need closeness, that they are safer when they stay removed. This works for them as long as the anxious partner is still playing their part, because the anxious person's pursuit creates just enough reassurance that love is still available whenever they might want to access it, even if they aren't ready to admit it. But when that pursuit ends, the avoidant no longer has a buffer against the emptiness that comes with their distance. For the first time, they are left with a silence they can't outrun and an absence they can't disguise, and that silence pushes all the suppressed emotions to the surface. This confrontation with their own feelings is jarring because it dismantles the stories they've told themselves for so long. They may have believed they were stronger without needing anyone, that detachment was proof of independence, that they didn't care as deeply as their partner did. Yet when the anxious person walks away, grief, regret, longing, and even shame begin to bubble up. Emotions they never wanted to admit were there. The avoidant might replay moments in their mind where they dismissed affection, rejected vulnerability, or shut down conversations that could have created closeness, and suddenly those moments don't feel like control. They feel like loss. This confrontation with regret is one of the hardest parts for them to face because it exposes the reality that their defenses have cost them something real, something that might not return. The emotions they've been running from finally catch up, and the avoidant begins to realize that the very thing they feared, intimacy, was also the very thing they wanted but could not allow themselves to accept. The avoidant often experiences these emotions in an intense and private way because expressing them openly is not a skill they have cultivated. Instead, they might throw themselves into work, distractions, or new connections in an attempt to numb the feelings, but no matter how they try, the truth still lingers. The person they pushed away mattered more than they allowed themselves to admit, and now they are forced to sit with the consequences of their withdrawal. This can bring up deep discomfort because it touches the core of their emotional avoidance, the part of them that has always associated closeness with danger. Now they see that distance does not protect them from pain, it only delays it, and in many cases intensifies it once they finally have to face it. That recognition can be overwhelming, stirring up feelings of sadness and vulnerability that the avoidant is ill-equipped to process. But it also represents a moment of truth they can no longer escape. For the anxious partner, this shift in the avoidant is rarely visible in its full depth, but the ripple effect is undeniable. The avoidant begins to understand, even if only privately, that their strategy of suppression is not sustainable and that running from emotions does not erase them. It only ensures they return stronger and harder to handle. This reckoning can mark a turning point in the avoidant's growth if they choose to lean into it, because it reveals that the very emotions they fear are the key to connection and healing. Facing suppressed emotions means confronting the vulnerability they have avoided, acknowledging their capacity for love, and recognizing the cost of keeping their guards so high. It is often a painful awakening, but it is also the doorway to a different way of relating, one where closeness is no longer something to run from, but something to embrace. The collapse of their emotional walls forces them into this confrontation, and while they may resist it fiercely, they cannot escape the truth that losing the anxious partner has awakened in them feelings they have tried their whole lives to bury. When the anxious partner finally walks away from the avoidant, the last and perhaps most transformative change is that both individuals are pushed into growth, but in completely different directions, and this divergence becomes one of the most defining outcomes of the breakup. For so long, the anxious and the avoidant have been locked in a dance where their wounds fuel each other's behavior, the anxious seeking constant closeness and reassurance, the avoidant pulling back to maintain a sense of safety and space. This cycle can go on for years, with neither party truly evolving, because the relationship dynamic itself becomes a kind of emotional holding pattern. But the moment it breaks, both are jolted out of the loop and forced to face what they have avoided within themselves. For the anxious, it becomes an opportunity to grow into independence and self-validation, to break free from the need to chase someone who cannot meet them fully. For the avoidant, it becomes a confrontation with their fears of intimacy, with the realization that their distance is not strength, but a barrier to the love they secretly crave. The anxious partner's growth often manifests first as self-restoration. After so much time spent overgiving, analyzing, and waiting for the avoidant to change, walking away opens the door to rediscovering themselves outside of the relationship. They may begin to reconnect with parts of their identity that were suppressed, while all their energy was invested in trying to hold the connection together. This can look like pursuing passions, setting boundaries, or even just remembering what it feels like to have peace instead of constant emotional turbulence. That growth deepens as the anxious learns to validate their worth internally rather than depending on external reassurance. The fear of abandonment begins to loosen its grip because they see firsthand that leaving does not destroy them, it strengthens them. With each step into independence, the anxious partner begins to build a healthier template for love, one based on mutuality and respect rather than desperation and fear. For the avoidant, the growth comes in a different but equally important form, though it often feels more like discomfort than progress at first. Losing the anxious partner forces them to confront the reality that their strategy of avoidance cannot protect them from pain. It only delays it and magnifies it when the loss finally comes. They are confronted with the emptiness left behind when there is no one chasing them, no one holding the space while they withdraw. That absence can stir deep feelings of regret, loneliness, and even longing that they are not used to facing head-on. If the avoidant chooses to engage with these feelings rather than run from them, this becomes the beginning of their growth. They may begin to see that true connection requires vulnerability, that love demands openness, and that their walls have not been protecting them, but isolating them. This recognition can lead to profound inner work if they are willing to face it. But even if they resist, the seed of awareness has been planted, and it shifts the way they view closeness and relationships. What makes this change so significant is that it forces both people to step into versions of themselves that were hidden by the dynamic. The anxious grows into strength, independence, and clarity, realizing they are whole without needing to chase love. The avoidant is pushed toward vulnerability, accountability, and the recognition that intimacy is not weakness, but the very thing they have been starving for. These growth paths do not always lead the individuals back to each other, and often they don't, but the impact of this transformation ripples far beyond the relationship itself. It changes how they show up in future connections, how they value themselves, and how they navigate love going forward. The breakup, painful as it may be, becomes a catalyst for deep personal evolution, and the forced growth it triggers ensures that neither person will ever